Hello, everybody. Can I start pulling people in, and we'll get started. Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. It's our first Banbury Uprising event, so this is a little bit of a test of concept, really, just to see if there's appetite for it. We are being recorded today, so the talks and the singing that you're going to hear will be available online on our site once we've worked out how to edit it all, so give us a few weeks for that. I'm Cassi Bellingham. I'm a member of the North Oxfordshire Socialist Alliance. I think I know most people here, but we've got some few new members, so do come and say hi afterwards. We've got so many different organisations represented in the room. We've got Woodcraft Folk, we've got our Banbury Action Group, is it? Banbury Action, have I got that right? Banbury Community Action, you'll get that right. They do lots of amazing stuff. We've got Extinction Rebellion for a little bit of rabble-rousing energy as well, because you always need a bit of that. And we've got the amazing Sea Green Singers. They will do a good job of kind of introducing themselves and what they're doing. And they've got a little special treat for us today as well. I will talk about the speakers a bit later on. There is tea and coffee out there. There'll be some available after the talks. And please do stay around afterwards as well. You know, we've got the room for about an hour afterwards. So stay, meet people, say hi, do some networking. The theme of the day is Banbury's Back Rooms, and it is celebrating some of the historical mischief that happened in our town and region, including workers' rights that were won and lost, bits that we will never know. One of my favourite details about some of the local coaching inns is there are historical records of people who you'd come and book a room under false names, and they'd come and stay, and there'd be 4 or 5 of them. They'd be here for a couple of hours and then disperse and not stay. And this was during the time when there was all sorts of revolutions being planned and all sorts of mischief. That's the same today. That spirit exists in this town. We are not a Tory town, as we've just discovered. We're a Tory light town now, I think. Muller Light's version. We're a red Tory town now, which I might be better. We'll see. But there's still lots of plotting going on in our back rooms. There are people fighting for workers' rights. There are people fighting for human rights. There are Palestinian action groups. There are people fighting for the people of Yemen, for Rohingya Muslims. There's lots of people putting a lot of their time and passion and energy into trying to make the world a better place. And sometimes we don't know what's happening in our back rooms, and we don't think it's for us. So I'm hoping if you're not in any of those back rooms yet, I know many of us are, that this might inspire you today to join some of those battles. So I'm going to let the Sea Green Singers come up, and they will sing for you and tell you all about what they're going to do today.
In 2019, Banbury, alongside Oxford, has some of the most deprived areas in the county of Oxfordshire. 6% of areas were ranked as being within the 20% of most deprived areas in the country. And this was an increase from 4 in 2015. So that's the last records I found, so I dread to think what it's like now.
You don't need charts, you don't need graphs to see the gap between the have-nots and the haves. You don't need to measure in inches and feet the
The Levellers were revolutionaries, and we sing every year at Burford where 3 levellers were shot. Those 3 levellers are sometimes called the Banbury Levellers, because that is where they came from. There was a mutiny in Banbury. Troops under Captain Thomas went to join the Levellers in Salisbury. Cromwell promised them no violence, safe passage. Guess what? He lied. He attacked them and killed many of the Banbury Levellers. A few days later, their leader, Captain Thompson, was killed as well. Sometime later, they took refuge in the church at Burford, thinking they'd be safe. There's a long tradition of refuge in churches. They weren't. Fairfax and Cromwell came and shot 3 of those levellers at Burford, and they came from Banbury.
We fought for a world where all people could be free. We fought in the Civil War to where the power of the monarchy, seeking justice for all be sure.
As the war went on, the rules seemed to change, but generous words were lies.
We shall not give up, we shall not give up. One vote and peace our cry. One vote and peace our cry. Together we marched as strong as the sea. Sea green was the colour of our standard. We not take part in the Irish killing spree. We strode towards Oxford.
We stopped for to rest, that's where we were caught out. Took refuge in the church at Burford.
We shall not give up, we shall not give up. Then Fairfax shot us dead. He shot 3 levellers dead. We were known as the Levellers, and they for which we're proud. A belief that we are all equal. Levellers we were then, and the Levellers we are now. We work for the good of all.
We speak against injustice for those who have no voice. We'll stand in all situations.
We shall not give up, we shall not give up. The struggle carries on. The Levellers carry on.
Thank you. We have you down as a Republican town. We may be wrong, but hope is there. Certainly you were parliamentarian in the Civil War, so hopefully that's continued. The next song, Charlie Is Not My King, we wrote to a traditional Scottish tune which you will know, so it'll be very easy to join in the chorus. Simon Hill in Oxford, who is a Republican and a pacifist, was walking through Carfax when the proclamation of Charles III was made, and he shouted out, "I didn't elect him." And he was arrested by the police, who then didn't know what to do because there was no official way they could deal with him. So they released him. I think he's now suing the police for wrongful arrest. So we wrote this song for Simon, in a way, in recognition of Simon. Charlie is not my king. Didn't vote for him. Charlie, 2, 3.
Charlie is not my king, not my king, not my king. Charlie is not my king, I didn't vote for him. How can we in democracy free kings still have their place? How can we on our currency still put a royal face? Oh, Charlie is not my king, not my king, not my king. Charlie is not my king, I didn't vote for him. How can we have a monarchy in this modern state? How do the poorest people live beneath the system's weight?
Right, because this is a special occasion, this is one of those songs written for a special occasion. Sarah and I wrote it based on the rumour that before the Battle of Edge Hill, which was fought not far from here, Cromwell, possibly with other people, plotted in the back room of the reindeer, of the old ye olde reindeer as it's called now, I think it was just called the reindeer in those days, that he planned the battle there. Well, I did some research, I couldn't find anything to support that, but it was such a nice idea, that I thought, well, one of the reasons why I don't think it's true is because apparently he arrived late for the battle. So it's not a good position from which to plan the battle, is it, when you're arriving late? So he came from Cambridgeshire, leading a troop of horse, and he was late. So, anyway, so it's about, well, perhaps after the battle, which ended rather unpleasant, inconclusively, and with a lot of deaths. They might have gone off to Banbury pubs to say, what was that all about? Could we do better next time? Okay, and because it's a new song, it's not part of our repertoire, it might require a bit of conducting. We tried it earlier, and the last verse didn't quite come together. So that's why I'm here.
It's got all the words on that song. No excuse.
So the last verse goes a bit slower. That's where it came apart when you were
Know the story. Okay.
So you can find it.
Okay.
Plotting in the back rooms, plotting in the back rooms, plotting in the back rooms of Banbury. Is it true that the night before the first big battle of the Civil War, Cromwell plotted on the stone-flagged floor of the Reindeer Inn's back room? They sing platters for pike and musket tunes, and serving spoons for his light dragoons, showing Charles represented by an old spittoon, being strength to defeat and doom. Cromwell plotting in the back rooms, plotting in the back rooms, plotting in the back rooms of Banbury. Plotting in the back rooms, plotting in the back rooms, plotting in the back rooms of Banbury. Not true!
Cromwell came late
To the fray, neither side had a plan, neither side won the day. Just a clumsy bloody draw, and the king got away, and 1,000 dead left round. But after the battle, when Charles scurried off, did the Roundheads stagger to the alehouse to quaff, saying, comrades, our brothers weren't good enough, so better ways must be found. Aye, plotting in the back rooms, plotting in the back rooms, plotting in the back rooms of Banbury. Plotting in the back rooms, plotting in the back rooms, plotting in the back rooms of Banbury. Who knows? It may have happened so. Common
Sorry to get me, but aren't they brilliant? I have to say, I'm totally blown away, really impressed. The reason you're seeing me for a couple of seconds is the next song is about the foundation, really, of Quaking, or Quakers, I should say, in Banbury. We call it Quaking here. Similarly, I've taken a little bit of poetic license with the song because the names aren't quite right. You know, you have to disguise the names of the innocent, etc. The background to it is that Banbury Jail, which was in the marketplace, was a horrible, fetid, really horrible place to be. And a couple of Quakers, the local leader of the Banbury Quakers, Ann, yes, female leaders even in those days, was imprisoned there, and she had a horrible time in there. If you can picture it, the jail was below the level of the road, and in the marketplace was the town pond, which was disgusting, and of course sewers. All along the roads, there was a stream leading through the marketplace. It must have been absolutely appalling. She was in there for several months, and a chap called Richard Farncombe was sent down by George Fox from Yorkshire to actually rescue her, get her out. Of course, Banbury's very enlightened magistracy decided in their wisdom to imprison Farncombe as well. So Farncombe then made some lovely speeches from the jail through the grating into the marketplace, and people gathered round. This really upset Lord Saint Seal, the fines of the song, and he promptly announced that they should be, the people should be dispersed. And in one of his little pamphlets, now this is the apocryphal tale bit, actually, a bit like the last song. This bit's slightly apocryphal. Apparently, in one of his pamphlets, he then accused the Friends, as they then were, of making all sorts of malarkey and quaking in the marketplace. Hence, Quakers. So we think we are the town. We're one of the many towns that claims to have invented the term. And the sea singers, I'm sure, do a nice job. Thank you.
So in Tadworth and Loughborough, they were part of riots that took place mostly in the south of England. And Captain Swing was a mythical figure, but they signed off the letters, Captain Swing, of threats to the church and to farmers and to magistrates.
We're singing this song thanks to Graham Moore, who wrote it, who's a singer-songwriter. I contacted him and he was very happy for us to sing his song.
The sun's gone down, the shutters drawn, the curfew bell has tolled. The fox is lurking round the farm, the brown owl's wings unfold. swings this way tonight, there'll be no corn to grind. Oh, Cherwell, the flames are leaping high. The ricks are burning, blows the coals, Captain swing not high. Oh, Cherwell, the flames are leaping high. The ricks are burning, blows the coals, Captain swing not high. The labouring man is on his knees, nowhere can he get high. 6 new machines that do the work the farmer has acquired. But how he sweats when he reads the threat the paper morning brings. Destroy your gear or else I swear you pay down Captain Swing. All over Cherwell, the flames are leaping high. The ricks are burning, blows the coals, Captain Swing not high. All over Cherwell, the flames are leaping high. The ricks are burning, blows the coals, Captain Swing not high.
This next song talks of solidarity and choice. Last time I sang it, myself and Marie and a couple of people from our sister choir Red Kites stood in Banbury. We stood on the pavement with a dirty great blow-up rat on one side representing the bosses, us and pickets there. Cars going past, vans tooting, buses giving support. I just need to say a few words. JDE, fire and retire. Let's say no more. What we learn from the levellers is that taking sides, being in solidarity is important. We need to hold on to our values. But it is not to give unquestioning obedience. It is to question those who seek to represent us and our values, as well as those values, and to fight for them. Which side are you on?
Come on, you people, you women and you men, once more our backs onto the wall, we're being attacked again. Which side are you on? 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 Which side are you? Which side are you on? Don't scab for the bosses, don't listen to their lies, as workers haven't got a chance unless we organise. Which side are you on? Which side are you on? Which side are you on? Which side are you? Which side are you on? Which side are you? Which side are you on? We fought a million battles to defend our hard-won rights. We're going to have to fight again, and I ask you here today. Which side are you on? Which side are you on? Which side are you on? Which side are you? Which side are you on? Which side are you? Which side are you on? It's time for a decision, and you really have to choose. Defend the workers' struggle, or the next in line is you. Which side are you on? Which side are you on? Which side are you on? Which side are you? Which side are you on? Which side are you? Which side are you on? 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 Which side are you? Which side are you on? Which side are you? Which side are you on?
Okay, so we've done our set. You've got the words now of the song written for this this occasion, and the last song is We Have Got the Power, which applies to us all. So we don't want to sing it at you, we want to sing it with you, and it's We Have Got the Power, it's in the hands of all. So I'm going to teach you, your part is going to be the bass line, is that all right? So it goes like this. We have got the power, do that. We have got the power. The next bit is, we have got the power. So it's the same thing upside down. We have got the power. From the go. Now, we have got the power. We have got the power. Half the song. The second half goes, we have got the power. Notice the difference. We have got the power. So it does not go down. It goes, we have got the power. Try it again. We have got the power. It's in the hands of all. It's in the hands of all. The whole thing. We have got the power. We have got the power. We have got the power. It's in the hands of all. Brilliant. Shall we go and stand down there so we're not kind of standing over you? We have got, so you're on the bass part, that's brilliant. Should we do it again just to prove it? But I might have been beginner's luck. Here we go. We have got the power. We have got the power. We have got the power. It's in the hands of all. So now we're going to put our part
So, thank you so much to the Sea Green Singers. That was amazing. It was really good. And our own song, how awesome is that? We can create all sorts of mischief with that. Does that sound okay for everyone? It sounds good up here, but I think we could probably even do without the PA in this space. It's so good, but it's good to have it. So we've got three talks today. They're reasonably brief, so don't worry. And I'm at the end, so if we're overrunning, I can pull it in. So we should finish on time. Do stay around afterwards for tea and cake. If you've got gluten-free or vegan needs or anything, let us know, because we've got like stuff stashed away so it doesn't get all eaten up by people who don't need the vegan and gluten-free. So I'm going to hand you over to our first speaker in a moment. Before I do, I just wanted to give a big shout out to Unite, who have funded us today. You'll see their banner over there, and there's a leaflet on all of your seats from that. Quite a few of us are Unite members or members of other trade unions, but Unite's been particularly good at this kind of community organising, funding this kind of event. And the North Oxfordshire Socialist Alliance, it's not a political party. We're not aligned to any single political party at all. We work basically on community issues. We joked we're a bit like a shadow Labour CLP, like a constituency Labour party, doing the things a Labour party should do if they actually existed in that way, which they don't in the same way anymore, unless you're a big business, and then they're at your door. None of us are big business, so they're not. So because of that, we do get a bit of support from some of the unions, because we're not technically a political group, although everything we do is political, as is life. So our first speaker is Professor Ann Hughes. We heard her at Levellers Day. I think it was 3 years ago now. Was it 2 or 3?
I think with COVID and stuff, I think it's probably 5 years.
5 years ago.
I don't know. Time has gone peculiar, I think, with
Had
COVID.
to make us all feel.
I think it's longer.
Longer than that, yeah. So some indeterminate time.
Yes.
Back in
living
few
memory.
grey hairs
Yes.
back. We heard Anne speaking. There's a big contingency from Banbury that usually goes through to Levellers Day, and she's speaking very much about the history of this region. And we said at the time, wouldn't it be great to get her through to Banbury to do a talk about that and to share some of that expertise. I thought it had taken us a whole 3 years to do it. We've been even more glacial than that, apparently. So I will let you introduce your work and what you do, and do plug books and things as well, because I know after the last Levellers I ended up ordering some really great books. So I will hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Carrie. It's a great pleasure to be here, I have to say. I feel a complete fraud because my knowledge of Banbury and its people is very limited, and I think you know quite a lot from the songs and the discussion about the Quakers. I think you know quite a lot already. I'm a historian I'm retired. I live in Lichfield, which, like Banbury, has just got a Labour MP. I'm actually a Labour councillor, so I'm one of the more compromised people, but it's very nice to be here. We've run the City Council, which is a parish council like Banbury Town Council, for the last 18 months, and we apparently had the 10th highest swing to Labour. We weren't supposed to win the seat in the summer. I know I'm going to start just very briefly. I'm a historian of the English Civil War and Revolution. I know quite a bit about Warwickshire. I'm lamentably ignorant about Banbury, but I've done a little bit of work, so I'll be talking as much about the general context as about. As one of the songs said, between the 6th and 9th of May in 1649, just after, how many months? 4 months after the public trial and execution of King Charles I, there was a very, very significant mutiny, really all round, sort of between Oxford and Salisbury and Bristol and Banbury. And I'll explain some of the context of it later, but a widespread mutiny. Historians think that what happened in Oxfordshire in the first half of May 1649 was the most serious attack, I don't know if that's the word, the most serious danger for the newly established republican but very oligarchic authoritarian regime until the eve of the restoration of the monarchy under King Charles in 1659 to 60. About 300 or 400 men under, as the song said, Captain William Thompson, came to Burford in, say, 6th of May 1649 and declared Captain Thompson, who was, I don't think he wasn't from Banbury, he'd had a whole history of subversive activity in the army going back to 1647. He'd been sentenced to death in 1647 for a mutiny against Cromwell, who was the second in command of the army then, and Lord Fairfax, who was the leader. And he'd been reprieved, lived to fight another day, and with a band of followers, 300 or 400, issued a declaration against the government called the England Standard Advanced in Oxfordshire. He said that the promises that had been made by the Parliament that fought the Civil War, the promises made to the people of this nation in behalf of their common right, freedom and safety, had not been observed, and that people had only been given bare words. The declarations of the army that I'll come back to, made in 1647, had been ignored, and tyranny, arbitrary courts, unjust taxes continued. No regard was had to the cries and groans of the poor, while beggary and famine, like a mighty torrent, hath broke in upon us. They said they were through necessity resolved to fight this new regime and to relieve the poor and settle this commonwealth, that was upon the grounds of common right, freedom and safety. And they declared that they chose to risk dying for freedom than living as slaves, referring to the agreement of the people, which again I'll say a bit more about, which was the manifesto for renewing the political structure of England by the Levellers, and they also called for the freedom from prison of Leveller leaders who were in the Tower in London. So how did it come to pass that they, I'll say a bit about what happened, we know it ended badly, but how did it come to pass that a civil war that had begun in a very limited way, or a relatively limited way, to rescue the king from his evil counsellors, to have reform of a national church, to have the rule of law more effective, how did it come to pass that there'd been a republic and that many of the most radical groups in England had been disillusioned by events? Lord Say Seal was mentioned, and Lord Say Seal was one of the parliamentarian leaders, one of the most important parliamentarian leaders. He was a friend of a man I've studied who died, who was actually killed in Lichfield, where I now live, Robert Greville, Lord Brooke, who owned Warwick Castle just up the road. So I want to say a little bit about how you get from Lord Say Seal as a parliamentarian leader to, if you like, Lord Say Seal very, very unhappy about these unruly women, Quakers, etc. So I want to say about the context in which the English Civil War turned out, very, very broadly. I want to say, first of all, the English Civil War emerged out of a century of social and economic change. And very simply, a time of economic expansion and, if you like, modernisation in agriculture, industry, overseas trade. And it's as with most, it's a period where there are obviously winners and losers. The population increases,
poverty increases. Some people in the middle and upper ranks do well, others, not so well. So you get what in rather evasive terms we call a middling sort, independent property owners, small property owners. Some of those do very well and become independent, some of them not so well. And there's great anxiety about poverty, opportunities for some, and less opportunities for the many. So life is quite precarious, and say time of opportunities and dangers, precariousness. And what you get, I think, is a sort of restructuring of social relationships. And Lord Brooke in Warwickshire, and to a lesser extent, I think, William Fiennes, Lord Say and Seal in Oxfordshire, they are popular peers, is the phrase that terms. They're great landowners, yes, but they also have their political power, and their political role depends to some extent on being seen as goodies on the right side. Against people hate Catholics, they want religious reform, and the rule of law against taxation that's just decided by the king. So they run, at the start of the Civil War, and I know more about Brooke than Say, they run popular campaigns to rally people to the Parliament side. Lord Brooke, in similar ways to Cromwell later on, says we don't want mercenary soldiers, we want people who'll fight for a cause, the cause of liberty, which they meant the rule of law, really, it's not a modern, and also they believed they were fighting a godly cause against a king whose religion was very dubious. So there's social change which has an impact on how people relate politically. Secondly, I want to talk about religion very quickly. Religion is at the heart of many of the ideological motivations at the time, and Banbury is famous for its Puritanism. It features in Ben Jonson plays by people who don't like Puritans, think they're, tedious hypocrites who just want to stop people having fun. There's arguments over maypoles, there's arguments over the town crosses in the early 17th century are pulled down because they're seen as signs of popery. And Banbury has a series of famous Puritan ministers, the most famous of whom, William Whately, dies in 1613. He's known as the Roaring Boy of Banbury because of his rousing sermons about, hellfire and damnation. But Puritanism, I think, that these sort of ministers are really the objects later on of the Quakers who think it's all terrible. But I think Puritanism, which most of us would not like to live under a Puritan regime now, it's regarded as, disciplinary, authoritarian. But it also stressed people's own relationship to God, reading the Bible, thinking for yourself, and they insisted that the English church needed reform. So the context of the Protestant Reformation in England is very, very important to the Civil War. England had a half-baked Protestant Reformation in many people's opinions. It was a church, to use the phrase, but halfly reformed. And so there is a drive for further reformation, for godly change. And once you start talking in those terms, it's difficult to stop. And so the religion is important. Thirdly, I want to say about the capacity of increasing numbers of the population to read. It's a period of rising literacy where it's a bit like computers. People are more literate, in our time. People are more literate than their mothers and fathers, and things are more, it's a socially determined skill. The rich are more likely to be able to read than the poor. Men are more likely to read than women. But everywhere there's enough people to read. And I think what the crucial thing is, Banbury is a parliamentary area, or the people of Banbury with their Puritan sort of upbringing are sympathetic to the Parliament. And Parliament uses propaganda, uses signing petitions, taking oaths. It's a cause that involves wide sections of the people in its aims. From the beginning, a man like Say, I think man like Say actually wanted a good job at the court, but you know but he wanted to be the advisor to the king, not the people he disagreed with. They wanted a more reformed, more Puritan, less ritualistic national church. They weren't about religious liberty or freedom. But they appealed to the people to join them through actions, through cheap pamphlets and propaganda. That this was not just, so it became not just a limited war for change at the top, but something about you were fighting God's war and you were fighting for the people's liberties, which are not closely defined, but they're very, promises were made to people. In the 17th century, it's probably the first revolt where printed propaganda and involvement in wide sections of the people were involved. The Dutch is a bit similar, but it's print and thinking about what you're fighting for, being offered promises of change is very important. The other thing I want to say, though, is that it's also a much more thoroughgoing, if you've seen, I don't know, films of people dressed in fancy clothes and stuff, it's a very onerous conflict. Civil war is a terrible thing, and in Oxfordshire, Warwickshire, you're right at the heart of it. It's a contested area, and in fact, I walked through the shopping centre where the castle must have been. Banbury Castle, for most of the war, is a royalist garrison. By the actions of war, it's not through the sympathy of the town at all. Edge Hill, the first battle of the Civil War that we heard about, Cromwell was an insignificant junior officer in 1642. He did not in any way be involved, was not significant yet. But the Battle of Edge Hill is just up the road. Warwick Castle is 12 miles away, something like that. Oxford's not far away. Oxford is the royalist headquarters. A garrison called Compton Winyates is just up the road. Compton Winyates is the stately home of the Comptons, who are teenagers, who are running Banbury Castle for most of the time, and they're not very nice people. So there's enormous suffering in this precise area. When the parliamentarians take Compton Winyates, which is in South Warwickshire, they put in a rather unpleasant parliamentarian commander called George Purefoy, and because the people around the garrison have previously, understandably, paying taxation to the royalists who, have the power there, he thinks they're all terrible people and threatens if they don't pay taxes to him. He says he'll come and fire your town and hang your constable, who's the tax collecting people. So there's a very significant loss of life. There's militarisation of this area in particular between Warwick, which is a big, significant parliamentarian garrison, Banbury, where the people in the castle are coming out, taking your goods, plundering you, imposing heavy taxes, and Oxford, which is the royalist headquarters. Just reading a standard source, the average burials in the 1630s in this town was something like 73 people. In 1644, there are 300 people buried in the town, and that will be direct consequences of war. It will also be disease, troops travelling through it, and so on. So it's a very, very heavy, demanding conflict. And I think the song about King Charles and the working together in an army, I think there's two different sorts of reactions. One is the solidarity of fighting for a cause, and then thinking that the limited aims you fought for aren't enough. Something has got to change for you. You've been promised, you're fighting on God's side. You've decided that what God wants in the church isn't what the authorities want. You've been told you're having liberties, so you want the law in English, you want probably more participation by men in, the vote and so on. You want more help for the poor. You want an end to the power of monopolies, big economic monopolies. It has to be said, for most people, by the end of the Civil War, they were probably not radicalised by it. They wanted it to stop. And what they do at the end of the war is they try to disband Parliament's new model army, where Cromwell is important, which had been raised in 1645 and has 2 years of unbroken victories over the Royalists. And it's sometimes called a praying army. There are lots of people who are sort of laymen preaching in it, don't need educated clergy to discuss. And Parliament, the dominant group in Parliament, tries to disband that army, apart from the ones they're going to send to Ireland, which had rebelled against English colonialism in 1641, and just send them home and without any sort of any of their grievances dealt with. And a declaration that William Thompson refers to in 1649 is very moving, I still think, still today, that the army in 1647 refused to disband. So they're all mutinying, Cromwell and Fairfax as well in a way. And they say, we were not a mere mercenary army, hired to serve any arbitrary power of a state, but called forth and conjured by the several declarations of Parliament to the defence of our own and the people's rights and liberties, just rights and liberties. So the mutineers in 1649 were arguing that their own commanders had now deserted them, and they'd come away from the declarations and the solidarity they'd made together in 1647. And so he was, and at the same time, there emerges amongst radical groups in London, the Levellers, of whom we've heard a lot today. And the Levellers and the army are intertwined, complicated ways sometimes, but the notion of religious liberty, notions that an end to arbitrary power, notions of fair taxation, expansion of the franchise for the Parliament, interact between soldiers and civilians, and then a sort of radical alliance, what I think a sort of alliance on the left is important in the winter of 1648-9 in driving against, with only a very small minority really of the original members of Parliament, driving through the trial and execution of the king. And so the king is publicly tried, he's not executed in a corner, he's tried for betraying his people and making war on his people. A commonwealth, a free state is established, and there's a very grand declaration that the people under God are the source of all just power. What the Levellers and radicals in the army see, though, is an equally authoritarian, very little change, still going to be sent to Ireland. Some of them, and it's very unusual, and in this context, some of them have some sympathy for Catholic Irish rebels. So the Levellers, the Leveller leaders who were in the Tower, who William Thompson refers to in Banbury, they issue a pamphlet, which you only need to know the title, England's New Chains Discovered. and which is basically a change of bondage is the utmost intended, is another phrase they use. They're immediately put in the Tower, and there's a big campaign to get them free. So the context is a period, the execution of the king was an amazing thing in the context of the 17th century. And say the public execution of a king, not, his second cousin strangling him in a tower or something. And many people are horrified. People are supposed to have fainted, miscarried of their children, etc., when they heard about it. But for other people, for instance, you may have heard Gerard Winstanley the Digger. He was clearly inspired by this great period of upheaval and change. And he talked about kingly power. We've got rid of the king, but we must get rid of kingly power, which he thought was, he was more radical than Levellers, wanted to make the earth a common treasury for all, etc., etc. So there's this period of great hopes. We've done the unimaginable, executed the king. What's going to happen? And nothing much seemed didn't seem that different. So it's a period of enormous optimism amongst a radical minority, but an important radical minority, who are doing an immediate disillusion. So to get back, I don't know how long I've gone on, but so to get back to Banbury and Oxfordshire, I say William Thompson gathers together amongst the widespread unhappiness in the army, because this has been an army, this is God's army, the people's army. They've fought for change. And something like 300 or 400 of them, 6th of May in Banbury, are then defeated. One of the songs said, killed, some are killed. I think a lot, move away, out of harm's way. Thompson and some others escape and meet up with other mutineers in the area. But the Banbury, Burford is very famous, Banbury less so. The dispersal of the troops in Banbury is crucial, really. It's something like 300 or 400 had gathered. Thompson is in hiding. He tries to escape, in hiding for the time being. There are, if the Banbury troops had still been there, other troops come up from the south, that there would have been a lot more at Burford. And as we know at Burford, Fairfax, it's so alarming to people that Cromwell and Fairfax, a bigger force, probably twice, but only twice as many as the mutineers, are sent out from London. And they, as we know, corner people in Burford. They basically surrender, and 4 ringleaders are marked out to be shot, and one of them is reprieved and the others are shot. Thompson survives for a few more days and lives up to his, and they track him down in, where's my notes? Yeah, they track him down in Northamptonshire, I think it is. Yeah, it is. And he decides, he sort of goes down fighting. He basically, he basically is shot. He's killed 2 of his enemies, and he sort of, actually charges them and is shot. And so that is something like the 15th, I think, of May. So that's
Is it that one?
Oh, right. And I just, so I think I've gone on too long, but that's the sort of context and how it comes up. I just wanted to say a couple of words about the Quakers. The Quakers, who I say are utterly opposed to the sort of Puritan divinity. They think, you draw on the light within, you don't need educated clergy. And there are Quakers in progressive movements nowadays. They're mostly, not always, sort of peaceable, quite, easygoing sort of folk. The 17th century Quakers were very subversive, trouble, unruly, and they were, as was said, women. Anne Orland of the song is from the northwest. She comes to Banbury with her servant Jane Warr. They're both put in prison. But there's also a woman called Margaret Vivers, who's the wife of a local person, a local official, who goes to the church, which they call the Steeple House, because they don't think there should be church, and basically publicly denounces the minister as a false prophet. And they call them priests, which is a term of abuse. It's a term of abuse if you're a Puritan. And she's put in prison as well. And there's a wonderful pamphlet you might be able to get called The Saint's Testimony, Finishing Through Sufferings, from 1655, which goes through all the people. The people Quakers in Banbury are very, very strong, both visitors and locally. And they do a very nice justification, because people say women should keep silent in the church, which the Quakers don't believe in the church, and they say they don't believe in women keeping silent. So I'm just going to end with a bit of when they justify, and this is about Margaret Vivers, the local person. They say, women were guided by the Spirit of the Lord as well as men, and God gave his Spirit in the male and the female, and they completely argue against the Puritan notion or the educated Puritan notion that women could keep silence in the church. So there is at least as well as mutineers and levellers, there's a great tradition of unruly women in Banbury, and I'll stop there.
That's a great place to stop, thank you. Unruly women, we need more of them. We will take questions at the end, so what we're going to do is do all three chats, and then so save up if you have got a question, make a mental note of it, and we will come back to it. As I said at the start, one of the things about today is trying to get that sense of the battles past and the battles present. And watching our news at the moment, I was struck by all this. How big a part religion played in these things, and fear of other religion, and and how present that feels today with what we see on the news, some of the narrative we hear from pulpits, from political speeches. It all feels very familiar, doesn't it? Very different battles, but very familiar narrative being used to make us all very frightened of things that we often don't need to be frightened of. And what feels so scary at the moment is that sense of breakdown of community and society, or at least the perception of breakdown in community and society, and the breakdown of our climate and our planet. And as COVID showed us, all of our fears and worries and perceptions of worries get swept away pretty quickly when a real crisis comes up, and we're on the verge of a very real crisis that will make all of our little petty squabbles about faith and beliefs and skin colour seem pretty small. So I'm going to hand over to our second speaker, who is going to talk about that side of life and about climate. We met on the hustings panel, running against each other for a parliamentary seat at this general election.
Yep.
And I take it as a sign of how you can work around these things, that we have a Labour, a Green and an Independent on this panel. I think the fact that we're a history event does protect us from the normal punishment that might be doled out otherwise for such cross-party solidarity, which is not the done thing in our current climate, but as a historical talk, we can claim a bit of vaccination from that. And I'm an independent, so I don't care anyway. But
I'm all right as a Green.
These two have to think about
I've got a fair
things.
bit of flex, so
Yeah.
it's all right. So first of all, I don't know whether I pitched my bit of a talk today at the right level, because listening to what's gone on today and some of the singing as well, it's great. It's really positive to see that there's already that element of collectivism. I think that's in the room. if I was looking to kind of title what I'm going to talk about, is probably Uniting for Local Change and the Power of Collective Action and Environmental Advocacy. So I suppose first to start off, if there is any expectation of me to try and convince anybody in this room that human-made climate change isn't happening, then I'm afraid I'm going to disappoint. I think we just need to look in the news and look out of our windows to understand that it is already happening. But I thought it'd be useful to probably give a little bit about my journey, because I think it helps in in the things that we can kind of think about and reflect on. So I grew up in a working class family in Stafford, so not too far from Lichfield. My father wasn't a toolmaker, just to make that clear. I went to a state school. I failed most of my GCSEs, but I was quite lucky that I managed to get onto an apprenticeship. And it was kind of that time when I was leaving school and starting that apprenticeship, which was the first time that I kind of really understood about the planet as such. And I didn't know huge amounts about it. But it was the time when there was a documentary that was on BBC on the Horizon programme called The Ozone Hole. And that was, as many of you are probably aware now, that was when it was first started to be discussed about CFCs and that kind of stuff. So that was my kind of first thing of ever, okay, there's something going on somewhere. I know, I don't know huge amounts about it, but there is something. And I think from that it's quite positive on that documentary and all the work that the scientists did as well, because that led to the Montreal Protocol, which being implemented, which had a really good impact on dealing with some of those issues. But my apprenticeship led me to go and work in the oil industry. That's not very environmental, but that's where I first started off. And I kind of worked there through the 90s and eventually left to come and work ashore in a place called Culham Science Centre, which is near Aberdeen, so not too far away. So I started working there on what was called, well still is the JET project, so the Joint European Torus, which is a project to look at alternative zero carbon energy. And what I really found amazing at that point in time, so because of that work, there was a lot of discussion about other environmental factors. So that really started my interest in understanding more widely what was happening in our world and what we could do about it. But one of the key things, it was a European project, but there was people there from right across the world. And just the collaboration of people working together on complex physics theory and huge engineering challenge. They were creating something which had vacuum-like space, and it was hotter than the sun. So people working internationally to come together and collaborate on working projects was a real fantastic thing to see. At that time, as I'd mentioned, I kind of understood a little bit more about the planet, but also about what was happening in the workplace. I was one of the group of workers which worked on shift, and it was very much that a lot of discussions that were happening with the employer wasn't taking into account what was happening to those shift workers. So that kind of gave me the first kind of step in the direction of starting to engage in trade unions in my first work with that. So I took the decision to become a rep, started engaging with my local branch committee in the employer, and eventually became the branch secretary there, and I did that for a good number of years. And I finally then kind of started to do a bit more what we'd probably most likely call now armchair activism. So that's sitting at home, seeing emails come through, signing petitions and that kind of stuff. And then I also started to engage with a couple of external groups, and the first one was 38 Degrees that I started to engage with. And they felt one of the first kind of groups for kind of my age in demograph. And I then got to the point that I was kind of like, I want to do more. What else can I do? I've taken some steps, and I wanted to see what are the next things I want to do. So I made the decision at 40 to go and work for a trade union full time. So a position came up, I applied for it, And that's where I still currently work at the moment. I've still yet to decide, and with my partner as well, whether that was a midlife crisis or that was me being altruistic. But it was a decision, I think, that I'm really glad that I took. And since then, last couple of years, I used to be a member of the Labour Party. I moved over to the Green Party because I felt, certainly with my environmental concerns, that was a better place for me. And within a relatively short period of time, apart from standing at district election, I was standing as parliamentary alongside the fabulous Cassi. So it's amazing, and I suppose the reflection for me on that kind of journey and what I've been through is that often we take small steps, and just taking small steps, you don't realise at the time the change that it's creating. And by taking some of that, I would have never have thought when I was late teens, early 20s, at that time I would probably thought I would going to end up in prison or something else at that time. But to think that I would be engaged politically, that I would be negotiating with some of the heads of our country and standing for a parliamentary candidate, they would have never have crossed my mind. But it's the journey I've taken to get there and the small decisions that we make as we go. So, kind of thinking about ourselves as society, and for me really probably about three principles that I think bring value to us as communities. And one of those is trade unions. Certainly at the moment, the other is about local environmental action groups. And lastly is the power of collectivism. So I'd be interested, there's no obligation for you to, but if anybody is a member of a trade union, are you happy to raise your hand? Cool, that's great to see. So some of you, I apologise, because some of the next bit might be a bit preachy to you, but to some of the others it might be helpful. But we've certainly seen from the perspective of trade unions in social media, on broadcast mainstream media as well, that the majority of the narrative that we see is about strike action, isn't it? That's most of what we see. And how that strike action impacts general public's everyday life. What we don't actually see is what trade unions actually do on a day-by-day basis. So as part of my role, I'm a negotiations officer for Prospect, and I regularly meet with lots of employers. I look after about 9 employers, and I work with them, meeting them on a monthly basis. We discuss all the challenges that organisation is having. We work through some of those issues. We provide a clear and concise conduit for information that's coming from its employees to the employer. And probably the most important thing about trade unions is that we want to see successful organisations and companies. And we want to see those with good quality jobs. And that's what we're about really, is that idea of wanting to see success, representing people, providing that voice to get to a situation where there is positive change for the organisation and those employees. As part of being trade unions as well, is kind of a catalyst for wider change. So often, there is that bit of a focus that trade unions are working on employee workers' rights, but often a lot of those discussions go above and beyond that. They kind of go out into and affect society and also the environment. And a kind of good example of that is next week, as part of my role, I'm training a number of reps to become environmental reps. And part of that work is that they can bring the challenges that we face, whether it's regards to a company's travel policy, whether it's about their energy usage, whether it's about supply chains, that they're bringing those issues onto the collective bargaining table with the employer. And to be honest, trade unions are in an enviable position because there is no other organisation that can be within a company to change its environmental direction. Apart from national legislation and regulation. There is no other organisation that can change businesses to make a change for the environment. And that kind of works. You know, most organisations now have environmental, social and governance targets as part of the work that they do. And there's a bit more of a traction internationally that a lot of those ESG targets now are becoming not more internal targets, but are going to become compliance. That there's going to have to be a reason that organisations have to adhere to them. And employees in the workforce can change those targets, can feed into those, and also keep those organisations on track and to task that they can achieve those as well, which I think to me is fantastic. So thinking a little bit more about environmentalism and outside of that kind of trade union sphere and where we look, there's lots of really great grassroots groups in Banbury and the surrounding Banbury. XR was mentioned earlier, but we've also got organisations like People Planet Pint, which is a great activity to go to if you enjoy having a pint and want to chat with like-minded green people. So I would always recommend that. But you've got organisations like Transition Banbury as well, which is looking at where we are now and what do we need to look at in the future and how do we transition there. You've got the Cherwell Swifts project, Banbury Climate Action Group, you've got Wild Banbury, Banbury Trees and Parks, and of course Green Party as well. And a lot of those organisations, it was through actually People Planet Pint where I first, as a great networking event, first understood about water testing. You know, we all know the issues with our rivers and the sewage challenges that the country has. And it was in that format, in that realm, where I first understood about citizen science. And I now take part in that. So I go out, I test rivers around the area that I live, and all that information gets fed back to a central database. So it is through those kind of groups, by looking at those and what they do and getting involved in those, which opens other things which I think are great. And also, there's other kind of community things. So there's recycling projects, community cleanup. And one of the key things that we do need to start thinking about in our communities, and this is something I was very strong about in when I was standing for MP, is our resilience as communities. Because we have got challenging times ahead. I don't want to spread a doom and gloom, but we have got challenges. And the only way we can really deal with those challenges is by coming together and building up resilience between us. There are lots of... How am I doing on time? Am I okay, Cassi?
You're good.
Okay.
10 minutes.
There's also a lot of other groups as well. So there's, when we look at parish council meetings, some of them can seem, anybody who's been a councillor understands that they're not sometimes the most exciting meetings that exist. But actually, attending some of those meetings and asking some questions can often be quite impactful. If anybody is ever interested in attending a parish council or council one, I will always advise you to ask if they've got a biodiversity plan. They all should be looking at the biodiversity now, so it's interesting to know if they've got one in place and whether you can have a look at it. But also, because there tends to not be much public engagement in those kind of spheres, when you do attend, your voice is actually heard quite well. So they are good opportunities. And I suppose if I was thinking about what would be the most impactful thing you could do now as individuals about the environment in Banbury, is you had an elected candidate, Sean Woodcock, and as part of his campaign, he said that he supports the Climate and Nature Bill. So that's a really important bill that's been put forward by other parties in relation to making quite a considerable change to what governments have to do on climate. That includes bringing in binding climate targets, biodiversity and nature recovery targets, and carbon annual budget reporting. And I think one of the most important things about that bill is that it would include citizen participation and oversight. So if anybody had the feeling that they wanted to raise a local campaign on environment, lobbying your new MP on his commitment to the Climate and Nature Bill would certainly be the one I'd recommend people would do. Talking about climate can also put some people off. As soon as you say the word environment or climate change, you get a whole swathe of part of our populace that turns off. Either they don't want to hear the message because it's too challenging to think about, or it's people who don't feel that it is an issue. But there is some of the global movements which I think are really interesting to have a look at. If you've not watched it yet, there is a documentary on Netflix called Blue Zones, and it's actually all about how in different pockets of the world there's people who live well into their hundreds with really active lives still. And it's really interesting that where they've studied those groups, there's a lot of commonality. Some of those those drivers is eating a more plant-based diet, which we know is good for our planet, having purpose in life, having some spirituality in life, and engaging in groups to work on collective stuff and voluntary action are all seen as things which assist and work together towards that living longer. So, and often a lot of the areas where they've even done experiments by identifying a city, and it's in America, which doesn't have any of those traits of being a blue zone area, and making changes where there's local transport, that the roads, the wider roads are shut, so there's more local transport, producing more local food and eating that local food, and they're starting to see the change where actually people are living longer and more active. So there are things to think about. If you ever talk about climate and you think somebody might not be, or they may be a climate denier, think about that different approach that you can have. Talk about something that's relevant to them on things like health, longevity. So when we talk about kind of the power of collectivism, and sorry to go back to trade unions on this, but they have been doing it for years, and we continue to do it, and it's effective, and we change employers and what they do and how they support themselves. The shareholder activism now, which is starting to come through, where people are buying shares in companies as well, to influence what those company decisions are at the highest levels. So we know that collectivism does work, but it's taking those opportunities for us to work together. The power dynamic that exists in all societies sits with the many, but we do know that corporations, previous governments, lobbying organisations look to divide us. And that is done on purpose. It's an effective strategy to divide people. And as opposed to building super yachts, mansions and sports cars over the last 20 years, we know what we should have been doing was building hospitals, building schools, and building infrastructure for our economy and for our society. I think the idea of this Banbury Uprising, I think, is a great idea, and it's a great first call as a step to seeing where this can grow. But certainly not just for us, but for our children and their children. So if there's one thing I could suggest today, if you haven't already done, is join a trade union. Because they are a force for change and a force for good. And secondly would be to engage in an environmental group in your local area, because we need to tackle the challenges that we're going to face. So I kind of got a bit of a request. So this evening, whether it's after a bit of tea and cake or whether you've gone to the back rooms of Banbury and had a few pints afterwards, so depending whatever time you get home, before you go to bed, just make a promise to yourself that you will do something. Doesn't matter how small it is, but do something that is to help somebody in your society and do something for your environment. My kind of closing words really is the power to create positive change sits with you. And when we come together, we can shape a future that benefits us all. Thank you, Cassi.
delighted you focus so much on trade unions, which is great. So the theme of collectivism is going to be the thread, I think, today. I will be the shorter of the talks, so we're almost done, and then do stay and have tea and cake with us. But we felt one of the things around this is about having a space where once a year, or maybe once every 2 years, if the energy isn't quite there for yearly, we do something like this that builds and grows and speaks to the challenges of the moment. Reminds us where we've been, reminds us the journey to get here. And speaking about trade unions is a really helpful way to think about that journey, because we wouldn't have weekends and workers' rights and annual leave, and I'm on adoption leave at the moment, and all of these things would not exist without trade unions, without people causing trouble, essentially, in their workplaces. And we all benefit from those, but very few of us step forward and enter the fray now because it feels subversive. It feels wrong to challenge the authority. It still completely baffles my mind that we were a republic for a while. We actually got rid of our monarchy. We did it. We had our revolution, and then we screwed it up. We failed the landing. We didn't land it. And then we went, oh, that's a good idea. Let's bring that thing back that was comfortable, and we know how. And every so often I remember that and think, how did that happen? How did we do that? How did we fail to keep something so precious that would have been so hard won, hard fought and hard won at the time? And of course, lots of people have very different views about the monarchy because it's comfortable for a lot of people. It exists, it's nice, there's tea and cake and celebrations every so often, and it feels comfortable until you sit and think about the absurdity of hereditary power at that level. And before I move on to the main bit I talk about, I'll tell a wee story that I remembered earlier. I'm ex-military. I was in the army for a while, which always surprises people when you're a rabid lefty that was actually in the military. But I did 2 full tours in Iraq and several shorter tours in Afghanistan. And we would have been deployed again the following year if not for the Queen, because we're so dependent on our reserve forces now that she has to sign a bit of paper called NOSA Act, which is a Reserve Forces Act that says, yes, you can use my reserve forces again next time. And people in the reserves have normal lives. They have normal jobs and families, and they're borrowed. The military borrows them when they need them in times of crisis. And they go away and give up 8 months of their life, and then they go back to their normal life. At the time, we were starting wars with half of the Middle East for very bizarre reasons that still aren't clear, other than oil and money. And we were really dependent on our reserve forces, and in some areas like engineers and medics and nurses, that meant those reserve forces were being deployed every single year. So after like 3 years of this, we'd sort of run out of time. They're not allowed to do that much because they have a life. And the Queen has to sign a special act to override that. So when we pulled out of Iraq and Afghanistan, it wasn't because suddenly the political will was gone. It wasn't because the oil reserves dried up, or they decided we'd won those and we could all come home and have tea and crumpets now. It was because the Queen refused to sign the RFA Act. She said, no, you can't have it. So they couldn't pull the reservists, so they couldn't pull in all of the reserve forces they needed to back up military action. So they went, oh, well, yes, we've decided to pull back. I'm very grateful to the Queen for that. But also, how ridiculous that one person decided that public policy on that occasion, that was for good. But how absurd is that one person who's never served properly, I mean, Queen Elizabeth was a mechanic during the war, but she's never been fully through the forces. She's never trained. She wasn't at that level. She shouldn't be making public policy decisions, but that still exists. So these battles are still with us, and we need to step outside their comfort, don't we? So the reason we've added this bit onto the end is because we couldn't have an event like this and not speak about what's happened over the last couple of months. The riots that we saw, the polarisation that we have seen in our society. I'm very pleased that there are lots of events starting to happen now. And while I remember, I want to just share that the Banbury Interfaith Network has an event on the 23rd of September in the evening at the Town Hall. And the event is called Peace, A Shared Approach. And that is an interfaith between all of the major religions in Banbury and beyond. There's guest speakers coming in from Oxfordshire. It's a bit broader than just Banbury. So please do come along to that and take part in that. So what we saw was a polarisation, didn't we? And we saw that touch paper thing catch, and the riots come out, and people try and burn down migrant hotels, and it was horrible, it was horrific. And then what we saw was an amazing counter-response 2 or 3 days later, where there were thousands of people on the streets. There was one place where they'd had 200 rioters on the Tuesday, and they had 11,000 people on the streets on the Thursday saying, "Not in my name." And that was a really encouraging and amazing thing. But one thing that was also really clear is the towns where there was a strong response afterwards, it's because there were existing groups that were already really active and could do the organising for that. They had a really strong Stand Up to Racism group, or they had a local interfaith network. There was something already that, like a web, connected different community groups that could pull that, resources immediately and get something organised, get the things you need to do that, the insurance, the permission from police, the social media push out, this is where we're going to be, to have stewards to keep it safe. And you don't see all of that on the news. You don't see that response. You just think this is a spontaneous thing, that the people have come out and done this thing. And if those groups had existed everywhere, if those networks were that strong everywhere, we would have seen that level of pushback everywhere. So what I wanted to do was just use that moment to just encourage anyone who isn't already reaching beyond your comfort zone into other groups to do that. And just whereas Aaron has asked you to, just do one thing this evening for climate, for others, a lot of us are very active in groups of people that look and think a lot like us. We might work really hard in one particular community group and do amazing work, but we're surrounded by people of similar politics, similar beliefs, similar interests, and we might not be pushing outside of that comfort zone in the same level. And it's those webs of alliances, it's just making those connections. And that doesn't mean you have to swap your friendship groups and be at the mosque every Friday night to say hello, but just somehow making those webs of connection are so important. And that's one thing we've been consciously doing, is trying to put delegates out to lots of different groups of making sure we're supporting. So if local community groups are doing something, that we as other groups are amplifying those voices and are doing those, and that we're building those networks. We know we're going to see more things like those riots. We know that because that rhetoric is still being used politically. So as long as it's still being pumped into people's living rooms, as long as our economic situation is still difficult, we're going to see that. And throughout history, we see this kind of splintering whenever the economic situation is difficult. People are hurting. They want to know why they're hurting. And when people at the top are failing to protect us from those economic pressures, it's really easy for them to go, it's the small boats. Or, I remember when I was first getting politically active, it was single mothers. That was the reason our entire society was collapsing throughout the 80s and 90s. It was single mothers. They're just everywhere. They don't do that anymore because there's so many of us that they'd be in big trouble. So they can't do that anymore. But now it's small boats. Small boats are not crashing our economy. PFIs are crashing our economy. The fact that every single time we access public sector services, someone's taking a slice of a cut at that's collapsing our infrastructure and our society. So I know I'm preaching to the converted here, but there's a lot of organisers in this room, so I'm speaking to myself as well, just how do we build those webs stronger? How do we make those more robust and more active? And I challenge myself very often of who do I see regularly, i.e. every fortnight, who's been in my house, because I'm fortunate enough to have lots of friends of lots of different communities, because I've been involved in the interfaith network here in Banbury and in Oxfordshire wider for 20 years now. But how many of them are in my home? How many of them are those people that would pop round for a cup of tea, or if I hadn't seen them for a week, they go, how you doing? Are we meeting up? Because they might be on the peripheries. They're not necessary because there's not that many points of commonality about our schedules or beliefs or whatever that might be. You have to push a bit harder to have those people closer in. And the closer in they are, then those networks spring when we need them, when we need them in crisis. And I don't want to be talking about the rise of the far right a month after a riot next time. I want to be out on the street on day 2, the way they were in Leicester and the way they were in Swindon and the way they were in Oxford. So I'm putting that challenge out to all of us, because we're all doing amazing work. Let's work better to get them connected. That's all I've got to say today about my bit. I'm just going to talk quickly about the leaflets you've got in your chair. You've got Unite, which is the union that is supporting us. They're definitely the scrappiest at the moment. They're the most left-wing, but they might not be the best for your industry. So if you're working, check out who's most active in your workplace and your industry. If it's more the activism side of stuff you want to get involved with, then I would recommend Unite or CWU. I'm always jealous I can't join the Fire Brigades Union. They're by far the best, but I'm not a firewoman, so I can't do that. And there's also a leaflet about the Barclays demos, which is one of the local actions and battles that a lot of our local groups are involved with. Barclays has been in the firing line for campaign groups for a long time, mostly because of environmental policy. They're one of the banks that is the least ethical in the way that the funds work. So does everyone know what an ESG fund is? I don't know if you've all heard it. It's ethical, sustainable governance, I think it's called. So if you've got a pension or an ISA or anything that's invested in stocks and shares, they're invested very broadly in the markets. So your workplace, if you're paying into a workplace pension, it's always a really good idea to find out where that's invested. Because if it's just a general fund, it means most of the profits it's making are coming from 2 sources, fossil fuel industry and the arms industry. So every time you see something going on in the news, you see bombs being dropped, that you're making money off that. Your pensions and your profits and your ISA might be, you go, oh, I got a bump for this month. What was that? Well, that was them bombing Yemen again. That was what that was. If you have an ethical, sustainable governance fund, then they will try not to, they'll do their very best. It's never perfect, I should say, but they won't invest in fossil fuels, they won't invest in arms industries, and they'll do their best to invest in companies that also have good governance, which means trade unions, workers' rights, that they rate reasonably well. That's the bit that's the weakest, is how that's monitored. Barclays is one of the worst, and they put a lot of their funds into the arms industry. They put a lot of their funds into the fossil fuels to a disproportionate level compared to many other banks. And at the moment, that's particularly in the news because of Palestine, because many of the arms that you're seeing dropped on Palestine, on civilian populations, are made in the UK, and the Barclays funds are invested into those funds. And, irrelevant of how comfortable you are with what's going on over there, what your personal politics are over there, nobody wants to go, oh, well, I funded that. Do you say, oh, yeah, that's my pension fund that's paying. Nobody wants to be in that position. So look out for the Barclays demos, where they happen locally and they happen in Oxford, and they hope happen across the board. What actions did we have? We had a few, didn't we? We had
Yeah, before you go to bed, make one promise to yourself.
One promise.
One promise to yourself on something, doesn't matter how small it is, and something that you can do for somebody else or for the environment.
So do we have any questions before we go for tea and cake? Did anyone? I know we've kept them to the end.
Do you want me to use the microphone, or can you hear me?
We can hear you.
So my question is, we've heard a range of different approaches to achieving change, from violent insurrection to working within the system, sort of lobbying or even using the current democratic system. What do you think is the most effective way of achieving change?
Should we go down the panel?
Well, I'm not advising in the current climate violent insurrection. I think, and I'm a pessimist, I suppose. But I think start where you are. I think that's it, and making connections with people, and campaign. We have parish council very somewhere. We have a climate change committee. I should go back and check. We have got a biodiversity thing. I was the mayor last year, and the mayor traditionally had a lady mayoress's at-home cream tea, and I didn't have a lady mayoress. So we've now been doing a school uniform exchange instead, which is not going to change the world, but it's a sort of, I Lichfield is a very conservative town with a small C, and has usually been a conservative town with a big C. So I think just trying to be a bit different, it's quite, I find it very difficult actually as to how I've made a decision to work within the Labour Party, having left it for a long time and rejoining it in 2017. Because I'm a pessimist, I think it's the least worst. But, you know, it might be, we have different people to lobby now, at least, and I think that's important. But start where you are, I think.
It's an interesting one. I think looking at it from the work that I do, and negotiating to get change within employers, it's far more effective to build relationships and build trust in order to get change which matters. So if I have an adversarial relationship with an employer, I am less likely to get the change that members really want. So I do find it far better that you do that kind of networking, you do that relationship building. But that doesn't deter that, you know, you don't always agree with an employer, and at times there is dispute. And that's where people coming together and being part of a group shows the power of those individuals to make that change across the line. Looking at it from the perspective of, you know, there's lots of decisions that need to be made in this country, and we've got our government to do that, and we've got the various parties and lobbying of governments at that level. And we all know that is a relatively slow process. So, you know, regardless of that, I think the key thing is to engage locally and support localism, because that's where real change can happen quickly. So, yeah, I think it's finding that right balance.
Yeah, I think all of the above, actually. You know, I'm not advocating going out and burning things down or beheading Charlie tomorrow, but I think there is... yeah, you know, we might get to that, but yeah, not yet, we're not there. I think it's all needed, that the working within the system is really important. I mean, I do a lot of work, my main policy interest is just transition, which the environmentalists among you will know, but particularly industrial just transition. So if you imagine you could go back in time 5 years before the miners' strikes, when you already had all the paperwork in front of you, you knew exactly what was going to happen to those industries and those communities, and you worked together with your local authorities and government legislation and planning departments and industry and said, we need to replace this industry, we need to move people over, we need to train them up, or these entire communities are going to be decimated. And we're in that exact same position now with the gas industry first. That's going to be the first big one that collapses, and then pretty much all of the fossil fuel industries. We're in the same situation where entire towns and communities are built around them, and all the businesses that exist around that are built on that, and it's all going to topple, and nothing is being done about that, nothing at all. There's no strategic transition plans whatsoever. And it was one of the reasons I joined the Labour Party in 2016, was they started talking about battery factories and just transition and industry change, and there was that strategic work was happening. So I think that's really important if we can work within those systems. But I think we need the agitators as well. You know, we absolutely need to be blocking motorways and causing disruption and getting on the nightly news. And yes, it's annoying and irritating and it's uncomfortable, but throughout history, that's what's done. It's almost like that tectonic pressure. You know, I was saying you're putting that pressure from lots of different areas, and every so often there's a shift. And there's a big shift and it's sometimes disruptive, and then afterwards it's all settled again and you've moved forward. And we look at all of our historical struggles. It's never happened without a bit of agitation as well. There's been no major gain we've ever had that has happened having conversations in committees. That's part of it. That's a really important part of it. But you need that. You need that on the outside. And I think finding where you're comfortable with and working in that area. And if you're uncomfortable with the agitation, that's fine. But don't get in the way of that. Don't be another voice going, they're just alienating people. It's the wrong thing to do. Don't do that. Don't get in the way of people who are fighting the same battle as you. It might not be what you're comfortable with, and there's costs involved, isn't there? You know, I've always promised myself, if I ever get arrested, I want to have a really good story that I have to tell at every job interview for the rest of my life. I don't want it to be I was just in the wrong place at the wrong time with people that got carried away. You know, it's going to be something, no, I meant that. I made that decision to take that risk. And if you arrest me for this, I'm going to be very proud to sit before that boss and go, you should still employ me even though I got arrested in, you know, whatever. So there are costs to that, but I think we do need them, and we have to watch, you know, those of us that are got a bit more educated and understand the system and see the really good ways you could do it, have to be really careful we're not too middle class and too uncomfortable and getting in the way of people who are actually fighting a fight that needs to be fought. So yeah, all of the above.
Can I add one quote at kind of the end of it? And this isn't a quote from back in history, this is a quote from Bob Vylan. If anybody knows Bob Vylan, a singer quite recently, I do encourage people to listen to him, he's great. You are not your monthly take-home pay. You are far more than that.
Any more questions before we go and get tea? No? Thank you so much for coming out. This is our first one, and to many more.
Cool.
Right.
Yeah,
I do.
No problem.
And it's 7:30 in the White Cross Park on North Bar. And there is no agenda. There is no work. There is nothing to take home to. You will not be assigned any actions. It is about people meeting, talking about sustainability over a pint. And if you register, great chance you'll get the first pint free. It's a great way of inviting people to the door.
We have red booths, but I think
Cool, thank you. Lovely.